Welcome to the Wayfinders podcast, where we explore the extraordinary journeys of people who've chosen to build lives in new countries. I'm Sasha Cody, your host, and today we have a story that spans 3 decades of China's most transformative period, told through the eyes of someone who has witnessed Shanghai's historical metamorphosis firsthand. So, our guest is Jason Spencer, who first arrived in Shanghai in 1993 as a university student on exchange from University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. To put this timing into perspective, when Jason first set foot in Shanghai, the iconic Pudong skyline didn't exist. The Oriental Pearl Tower was still under construction, and the famous financial district was largely farmland. The city had just begun its ambitious development plan, and the Shanghai that we know today, with its magnetic trains, sprawling metro system, and forest of skyscrapers, was barely a blueprint. So for Jason, what began as a 1-year language program at Shanghai's prestigious Fudan University evolved into a 30-year journey that paralleled Shanghai's staggering transformation. In 1993, when Jason arrived, most Shanghai residents lived in lane houses without central heating. Bicycles dominated the streets and foreign brands were rare luxuries. Today, Shanghai is a global financial centre, home to the world's largest container port, a city where technological innovation shapes daily life. You can get anything on an app delivered to your door within the hour. Throughout this transformation, Jason found love, built a career, and raised 3 children between cultures. His story spans Shanghai's evolution from a city eager to learn from the outside world to one that really shapes global trends today. During his time there, the city's population grew from 13 million to over 24 million people. Entire districts arose out of the ground, and there was a massive shift from a cash-based economy to one where street vendors prefer digital payments today. In this episode, we'll explore what Jason calls the liminal space, that fascinating territory of belonging to multiple cultures, while never fully being present in any one single, if that makes sense. Jason opens up about managing a family between Shanghai, between Hong Kong and between Brisbane, using TikTok to stay connected with his children's world, and how he goes about maintaining significant curiosity about China even after 3 decades of profound change. So if you're contemplating an international move to China or simply curious about China today, stay with us for a fascinating conversation about the rewards and challenges of choosing to live in the Middle Kingdom for such a long period of time. Most importantly, we'll learn why for Jason, it's not just about being interesting, but it's about staying interested in a city that never stops evolving. Okay, so let's dive into Jason's story right now. Let's go.
So how did the China thing first, conceive of itself in my brain? I'm not sure if I've told you this before, but my father was in the Australian Air Force when we were young. He had a posting to Butterworth Air Force Base. It was up in Malaysia, near Penang, across to the mainland of Malaysia. So we lived up there for about 6 to 8 months, and then he got posted to Singapore, to an Air Force base in Singapore, and we lived there for another 2.5 to 3 years. So
Yeah, wow.
that was in the late 70s. So for me, as a white Anglo-Irish kid growing up in Australia, that was an eye-opening experience. And, coming from a very mono-ethnic background where we had, on our table every night was meat, potato and 3 veg, and usually 3 veg. The 3 veg was for a really fancy dinner. So it was usually 2 veg, and it was usually frozen bird's eyes peas or corn or something like that.
Yeah.
And then having that experience in Singapore was really eye-opening for me and for the rest of my family. And
Mm.
so I think it just sort of started off two sort of trains of thought for me. One was that there's something very, very different in the world other than where you're living and what you're doing. And it was an amazingly rich and sort of, this like one of the words, the phrases I like to use all the time is that it's just part of life's rich tapestry. It's just an amazing out there above, beyond the horizon. So it started off that sort of awareness in me, and as well as just a general familiarity with Chinese culture. And I don't just mean sort of driving down the street and seeing all these Chinese characters. I mean, the smells of when people burn that incense or they burn the money at funerals, and the smells of the hawker centres, just the monsoon and the feeling of that happening in the afternoon in Singapore, and then drying up. So all these sort of very visceral experiences just be part and parcel of a very young kid's experience. And the kid doesn't pass those things out logically. They're just absorbed into their experience and they become sort of second nature. So when I graduated high school, I had to choose a university, choose a course to do at university. I chose Chinese as the language that I wanted to do because at that time, I think a lot of people in Australia were doing Japanese. Just felt that, well, if everyone's doing Japanese, it makes it harder for me to get a job. And then two, I just felt this sort of kinship with China and Chinese culture, and then just chose Chinese. And that opened up that exchange program to go to Fudan, which further emphasized that connection. And then by the time I graduated university, I was like, right, I'm going to get me a job in Asia, in China in particular.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, the 90s were really a period where, so certainly in Australia, probably, Britain, USA, Canada as well, Western countries, there'd been a shift from European languages to Japanese because of the Japanese economic boom. But then the crash, and so Japanese was still kind of administratively, it was still part of the education system and very popular. But Chinese was kind of emerging. And I always found, because I started learning Chinese in the 90s as well, at university only. And I always felt that it was like a little secret I was in on, that I was getting like a head start in a way on a language that would prove to be massively important, yet no one seemed to quite know that yet. And they were all a bit suspicious. And China was, I mean, it's an impenetrable culture in so many ways. I mean, even with the language, because I was going to say also on the whole not China hand topic, that like one of the things that I always found fascinating about China is that the more you know, the less you know. Like it's just so deep and thick, the culture and so on, and we summarize it and we give cliches and stereotypes and so on to explain things, but actually it can be very, very thick, the people's behaviors and relationships in China. And
well, Shanghai, the first year I was there was actually in 1993, and that's where I
wow.
met my current wife, Stacey. I mean, she was a student at University of Queensland in Brisbane like me, and we both separately applied to do a one-year exchange program at Fudan University here in Shanghai, which was just language focused, right?
Oh, okay.
It's one of those things. Fudan University has a very high reputation here in China, and so whenever I name drop that university, everybody looks at me with a newfound respect until I tell them that I only had to pay the money to go over there at the time. It wasn't because of anything that I'd achieved academically. But so one year in 1993, met my future wife. Get together for until quite a good few years after that in Taiwan, but still an important milestone for us. 1 year in 1993, and then back for good in 2000, and then stayed here until 2018. And popped back off the Chinese radar for a while, and then came back here this year and have been working here for the last 5 months or so. Language, where we had to translate an original piece of Chinese literature that hadn't been translated before, and then a lot of it was also around writing essays around culture and socio-political things.
So I didn't know this about you. So you're actually you've translated something that no one has ever translated before into English.
Yeah, because it was very obscure.
What was it? Was it like a newspaper article from Republican era about, I don't know, bathroom etiquette or something? Or what was it?
It wasn't quite that obscure. So there's this writer in China called Wang Shuo.
Oh yeah.
I'll send you
he's a critical theorist writer, very well known on the left.
Yeah, I mean, he'd written some fiction, and there was a novella called 千万不要把我当作人, which translates as to don't regard me as human.
Yeah.
And his writing came out in the early 90s, just
Mm.
as the reform and opening up policies had started to generate some traction in Chinese society
Yeah.
and creating a little bit of instability and just, what the hell, we're going from a iron rice bowl society to a society that focuses and defines success on entrepreneurship, on
Mm.
entrepreneurialism, things like that. And so a lot of his novels were quite provocative, and he used a lot of bad language, which appealed to me. And
Yeah.
so I kind of wrote an essay that was about identifying common elements between Wang Shuo's writing and, say, the punk movement in music in the UK and the
Oh,
US, and how it was about destroying, the culture that had come before it in a very crude and base way, but
yeah.
in and of itself, it had something to say and reflect on society. So I translated a novella of his, and I just remember being particularly enamored of trying to come up with equivalent swear words in Australian English that matched the Chinese. And I think,
Yeah.
at least in terms of the swearing part of it, I think I did a rather good job. During that period of, say, the late 90s to, say, 2012, 2013,
Mm.
that period of growth, in hindsight, was amazing. I mean, the golden
Yeah.
ages, you don't often recognize them when you're in it.
Yes.
Unfortunately, you need the
Yeah.
distance of time to be able to take a look back over your shoulder and see it. But I certainly see that as a time
Yeah.
where, as you mentioned, whatever category, whatever discipline, whatever industry was considered in China, it was developing very, very quickly. And
Yeah.
it's almost, if you look back at Chinese history and you look at particular high points like the Tang Dynasty, or later on a little bit during the Ming Dynasty for a time, there were these great periods of amazing growth where there was openness, there was accommodation of
Mm.
different ideas, there was acceptance, and I think we were very lucky to have lived in a period of China where that happened, and in particular where the Chinese people and Chinese government had agency in that development. So that's why I'm not mentioning the 1930s as a high point,
Mm.
because that was very much under a colonial administration, right? Yeah, look, I agree. And you mentioned this before about Chinese culture being thick, as in expansive. Um, when we say that we were very lucky to be in China during this golden age, I certainly don't mean just economically. I mean, there was a lot of social stuff going on at the same time that we were very fortunate to have been witness to. And, whether it's literature or rock music or, any of those sort of other elements of a society, I think they were all undergoing great transformation, as any human society does under the pressure of that kind of rapid change. And it's important that a society has those outlets to be able to hold a mirror up to itself and try and work out what it
Mm.
wants to be, and where it comes from, and how to infuse their very long history into a more modern setting. And I think those are healthy elements of any
Yeah.
societal examination, introspection. I won't get too political. I think that's sort of the juices that were flowing in that period have come off the boil a little bit now for various reasons. But I
Mm.
think, again, I feel very privileged and very grateful that I had the opportunity to be there at that time. I don't want us to sound like these two old farts sitting on a veranda and talking about the good old days. That's a good way to put it, because when you talked to me about this podcast, I started thinking about, what do I have to say? Do I have to say about this?
Mm.
And there's this term there's, in terms of what, if you use the word wayfinders, there's people that immigrate from one country to another. They have an intention to permanently move somewhere else and adopt the trappings of that country. And that's absolutely fine. And I think it's one of the great 20th century accelerants of goes beyond the 20th century, but it's certainly, you look at countries that have a high level of successful immigration, those countries are doing well these days.
Yeah.
Canada, Australia, US. And then there's another type, which is this expat, which is kind of people that dip their toe in the water but
Mm.
don't fully become immersed in it. They can be, I have many conversations with this group of expats, and they go to their barbecues or their yacht trips around Hong Kong and things like that, and they usually talk about and complain about their maid not really understanding just
Yeah.
all these super, super cringe topics. They're just
Yeah.
really don't drape themselves in any sort of honor. And there's that middle one, the liminal place, which is neither belonging to either culture. I'm not quite Australian. I cringe when I hear some Australian stuff sometimes. I'm like, ooh, that's a bit, Australians, when you're outside your own culture, you get a unique perspective back into your own culture. And you think,
Yes.
Australians can be sometimes quite insecure about their place in the world, and they sort of overcompensate on certain things, a la the Olympics, right? So you can see that. And you're not quite part of the culture that you're in as well, so you get a unique perspective into that. And for me, that's enormously valuable to my psyche, for however that developed. And that's what I need. I know that. The flip side of that, it can sometimes be quite lonely. It can be sometimes puts you in that liminal space where there's very few other people that sort of exist there. Now, I'm not trying to, big myself up and say, well, I'm unique and I'm, all this sort of stuff. I mean, it's just what I need to be happy. And sometimes you can be in a situation where you sort of belong to both cultures, but don't belong to any culture. And then, in particular, in my sort of progression over the years, I'm moving from country to country to country. Like I was talking to Stacey the other week, and we and me in the last 5 years have moved places 6 times, right?
Yeah, wow.
It's like,
yeah.
I know how to do that now. It's a forte. I should put it on my resume that I can acclimatize myself within a couple of days. Just that you're talking about that liminality of this just really sparked that for me. And I think it's a really interesting lifestyle to be belonging to more than one culture, but not really truly belonging to either one. I sometimes fear that what my retirement will look like. Will I be ever able to settle in one place? Will I be content, be happy? Will I be satisfied? Or is it going to be this continuing need to uproot myself and plant myself somewhere else? It's like I'm addicted to it perhaps by now.
What does the future hold for you, Jason? Like, actually, do you mind if I ask you about being apart from your family, like how that is? Because this will be really, I think, a topical thing, So, Jason, can I ask you about your living arrangements in Shanghai with your family and so on?
Yeah, so I think, I mentioned before that my wife and I experienced a lot of our overseas living together as a couple, as a friend first, and then as a couple. And all of our kids were born whilst we were living in China. And they spent the first 8 or 9 years of their lives in China and staying with us. They also came to me to live with me in Hong Kong, but COVID kind of threw a spanner into the works there, and it was very challenging for the kids to try and start a new school in a new country online. And I think COVID impacted Brisbane fairly lightly in the greater scheme of things. And I'm not saying it was like Melbourne; it was much, much better than Melbourne.
Yeah.
And so we as a family we made a decision that my wife Stacey and the 3 kids would go back to Brisbane. I mean, it's a heaven for schools and kids of that age, and I really didn't want them to be living in a small apartment and finding it tough to immerse themselves in school. Pitch it into the relationship as much as I could be. FaceTime helps. We live in a society now where I FaceTime my kids pretty much every day.
Yeah. Do you do it is it multiple times a day even maybe? Or
yeah, multiple times. So I have to do it, for each of the kids alone and separate. You need to sort of also, especially when kids are younger, you need to find a way in which you can engage a conversation. It's not natural for them to be speaking into a telephone when you're an 8-year-old boy. And so you've got to really get better at asking questions to elicit a response from them. One of the things that I do is I watch a lot of TikTok. A lot of my feed comes from Australia, so I still maintain my ethnographic ability to absorb what's going on in young Australians' minds and what are the new terms that people use, what are the memes that are going on. So I mentioned that to them. So it helps me there. The opposite of that is that, I look at some of the TikToks and I'll just sometimes unbidden start to cry.
Right. Because you think of your kids, right?
Yeah, I just think of that environment and what I'm missing out on. And I was talking to a friend the other day and I said, I got to stop watching so much TikTok because I'm dehydrating myself.
What does 2024 and 2025 have in store for you?
Great question, Sasha, because I've also been made redundant recently as well, which was, I took some comfort from some of your posts on LinkedIn about, how you sort of process that and everything. And that allowed me to get through, the 7 stages of whatever it is we go through when that happens. Like, number 1 is like anger. What the fuck, and then it's sort of acceptance, and then it's sort of,
Worry,
so I've gone from
night sweats.
nice. Well, I'm lucky. I've never let stress impact my sleep patterns. I'm quite lucky like that. But
Oh, that's good.
I think it's gone from anger and then a little bit of concern because I'm sort of running two households at the moment, right? One overseas and one at home, and I don't come from a very affluent background, so it's always been a constant need in my head to be out there earning. But I got to say, it's put me in a really positive mindset. I was in a job for the last 5 months, and I won't name the company, but it was quite a bit of a dumpster fire of different things happening. And I was working way longer hours than I'm accustomed to, not having the impact that I would like to have seen, and it wasn't a very good scene. And so this sort of really allowed me to sort of take a step back, take a couple of months off, and think about what is the next place, what is the next step for me. And it's funny that it sort of coincides with the thing that we've been talking about today. What allows us to define our next steps? Is it career progression? Is it something else? And that's made me think about that a lot. And so, from the conversations I've had with you, that for me it was about, okay, do I stay in China? Do I go to Singapore? Do I go to Hong Kong? Or do I go back to Australia? That was the first just default thought process, right?
Where will I be, and therefore how do I make it work? Exactly.
So that was the first process. And then it's about, like you said before, it wasn't about what's my next title, it was about what's the next meaty thing I can sink my teeth into, and how do I fulfill that inchoate need to be always interested in something and learning something, even if it doesn't have a direct impact on anything, but it feeds the furnace of my curiosity. So I think those are the two things that are guiding me. So I don't know the answer to that question. I am quite optimistic about it now. I want to take some time off to spend some time in Brisbane with my kids and my wife. The more I'm away from Brisbane, the more I really appreciate it and really understand it's just Brisbane's one of those, what I call a Goldilocks city, right? It's not too big, it's not too small, it's got everything there. It's much more multicultural than it used to be. And I want to spend a bit of time there and just sort of wrap my head around what is next for me. But my journey in Greater China is not over.
Well, any final pearls of wisdom, mighty one, that you would like to leave us?
No, not really. I mean, I was trying to find a poem that I read once. It was by, I think, a British poet, and maybe I'll try and find it for you later and send it through.
Okay, I can read it and
record it. I hope it wasn't Kipling, because he's a bit politically on the nose these days. But it was so I think it was somebody who wrote in the 20s or the 30s, and it was something like, those of us that travel neither belong to the donor country or to the recipient country, and we're always caught in between, never quite belonging. But that in and of itself is belonging to something, and it may be
I like that.
but it's
I belong to the space between these countries, or something like that.
Using that fancy liminal word. It made me think of that poem immediately. But let me look it up, and I'll just send it through to you.
Okay.
And if you want to hear it being recited in my dulcet tones, let me know.